in this group, oh, that's good to know. They explore and they problematize all of the different actors that are involved in community or private sponsorship. And we've got 4 presenters today. They're each going to take 4 or 5 minutes to present their research. And then we hope to have a kind of broad panel discussion between the presenters, and including questions from the audience if you have them as well. In terms of housekeeping, if you've got a question, feel free to just drop it in the chat. And I'll try and keep as much as an open eye as I can on the chat, so I capture them all. And also do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, just so we know where everybody's coming from. So I think, first of all, I'll introduce each presenter. I've got a short bio to read out for everybody, and then I'll let them present their research. And then after about 20 minutes, we should have about half an hour for questions. So hopefully we'll run on time. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, David Saluski, and apologies if that's the wrong pronunciation. But David is a PhD candidate at the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts. And his project explores how non-state religious groups mobilize to overcome the resistance of dominant political power configurations of the state in order to expand pathways to protection for refugees. And he's focusing on the humanitarian corridors in Europe as a case study. Prior to his PhD, David worked for 10 years in refugee resettlement in Boston. And for 2 years, he was the coordinator of a Colombian refugee project in Quito in Ecuador. So without further ado, David, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. Really excited to be here, and I'm glad that this group is looking at actors. That's sort of the main unit of analysis in my project, and I'm currently slogging through my analysis. So some of the findings I share are preliminary, and really looking forward to hearing sort of all your expert, insights and feedback into the discussion. So yeah, I'm looking at the humanitarian corridors, and my research is exploring and asking this question of how religious non-state actors, were able to overcome initial resistance, reluctance on the part of the political and administrative power in the respective countries. Looking at humanitarian corridors and looking at the pilot program that started first in Italy, and then that has been replicated in a few other countries in Europe, and Belgium is the other case I'm looking at. So I've been looking at analysis from interviews, some semi-structured interviews I conducted in both countries, a bit of participant observation, and also primary document analysis. So humanitarian corridors, similar to community sponsorship, exemplify civil society activism. And while they embody a form of cooperative politics, because the religious groups partner, partly necessity, with the government, cooperative behavior among the actors can't be taken for granted. And as Audrey Macklin observed in one of her recent papers, that public-private partnerships may actually entail much more resistance than might be supposed. The political context in Italy and Belgium, respectively, were not particularly favorable. It wasn't obvious that they would be favorable to policies expanding pathways to protection for forced migrants. Migration was a highly politicized policy issue in Belgium at the time. It even triggered the dissolution of the government at one point. And a right-wing nationalist politician held a position of Secretary of State for Asylum and Migration, and was the one in the position of either saying yes or no to the religious group's proposals. And even at one point, he himself also temporarily suspended the state-run resettlement program. And in Italy, the initial response from both the foreign and interior ministries to the religious group's proposals was a flat-out no. And yet the religious groups were able to sit down at a negotiating table and secure the approval of humanitarian corridors in both countries. And I find this fascinating academically, but also personally, especially when we look at a lot of the recent challenges to state-run resettlement programs. And we're seeing a lot of renewed interest looking at complementary pathways as ways of trying to expand pathways for forced migrants in need of protection. So yeah, humanitarian corridors, I think, are a very compelling case to understand how and why the religious groups were able to succeed in persuading the state to sponsor, especially when they have no legal obligation or perhaps no political incentive to do so. And so incorporating actors into the analysis foregrounds their strategies and their abilities to shape states' interests and to also share in the practical operations of state sovereignty. And also, because the non-state actors are religious groups, I think it's important that we bring in the sort of religious character and identity into the analysis that sheds lights on the group's motivation, but also the resources, the networks, both domestic and transnational, and the expertise that they can mobilize, but also taking into consideration the ways that religion and migration politics can intersect, and that can either facilitate or hinder collaboration between the state and the religious groups on establishing sponsorship programs like humanitarian corridors. In my analysis, a lot of variables and factors are emerging, but I think one key variable that I'm digging down in a bit is that the religious group's success in great part, or in part, was their ability to combine their privileged legitimacy, which is their direct access to political figures and political and financial structures. They were able to combine that with a rapid mobilization of financial resources, networks, personnel, which they then used as leverage at the negotiating table to convince the reluctant and even resistant state actors of the feasibility of their proposal, and also to allay concerns about political and national security risks, thereby securing considerable autonomy in the project design, from selection criteria and selection processes to the integration of the individuals and families. So one story I think that is emerging that my dad is telling is how the religious groups were able to make something possible against the resistance of the political and administrative state actors. However, another story emerging, it's important to pay attention to, is what might be the unintended consequences and challenges that may emerge when state actors and religious groups partner. Analysis, I think, what I'm trying to bring is sort of an analysis of the not so public negotiation process to see how the religious actors in specific ways could shape political outcomes. So even, for example, I see how there are parties have considerable divergent interests. For example, in Belgium, there was some tension and impasse over the very practical matter of agreeing who will be selected on what basis and from where. And in the implementation phase, there are power dynamics that emerge among the non-state and state actors in the selection process in the transit countries, which they find ways to try and contend with through ad hoc working groups. So they do have these sort of conflict resolution mechanisms that they're creating to try to do this sort of continual engagement with the state to operate these kinds of programs and to address any sort of frictions that arise. So I'll stop here because these are just a few examples that also kind of problematize partnerships among state and non-state actors and do raise some questions about the transparency around how these kinds of initiatives are designed. That being said, I think it is quite remarkable, and when we look at the actors involved to see the kinds of resources and strategies that could help maybe in some future reflections about ways to expand these kinds of initiatives in other contexts. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, David. That was fascinating. Next up, we have Gabriella Davino. Gabriella is a colleague of mine from the University of Birmingham, also based within the Institute for Research into Superdiversity. And her PhD looks at the social networks of refugees resettled in the UK, both through the community sponsorship scheme and also the vulnerable persons resettlement scheme in the UK. Prior to her PhD, she undertook a master's in social research at the University of Birmingham, and she also holds an MA in human rights, culture and social justice from Goldsmiths, University of London. Currently, she works as a research consultant for the International Catholic Migration Commission for the Share QSN project. And Gabriella, I'll pass over to you.
Hello, hi, thank you, Tash, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research today. I want to present my research framing community sponsorship in the context of the UK hostel environment. Basically, this research starting with the question why government, the community party that is promoting the hostile environment, that means policy that want to stop refugee and migrants to arrive in the UK and want to make for them difficult to stay in the UK, also promote an initiative as the community sponsorship scheme. Is very interesting because when it was launched, the community sponsorship at the Conservative Party conference in 2015, Theresa May was giving this speech and she talked about community sponsorship, and at the same time she remarked the UK need to take control of its border and to limit the arrival of refugee migrants. So to analyze how these two opposite point policy can coexist, I look at the parliament debate on community sponsorship, and which occurred between January 2014 to March 2020. And I analyzed a total of 42 documents adopting frame analysis. That means I exploring the diagnostic, prognostic, and the motivational framing that led to the development of community sponsorship. So when I analyze how the policymaker and the government was framing the problem behind the community sponsorship, I realized that they don't frame the refugee problem as a big issue, but is a problem related to or just to some specific nationality. In the case, it was a lot of the debate was a lot about Syrians. And not even all the Syrians. For instance, they were focused more on what they call the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And there are other kind of situation, refugee situation, where were not framed as part of the problem. For instance, people staying in the refugee camp were said to have a very livable life condition, so they didn't represent a problem to where they need to find a solution. So framing this problem as exceptional, so just a problem for some small group of people, not only create a distinction between the deserving and undeserving asylum seeker and refugees, but also create a hierarchy amongst the same refugees. So there are some refugees waiting to be resettled are deserving to be resettled. Other they are waiting, but they are not so deserving. When then I look what are the solutions to this exceptional framing problem, the solution is basically to stop the arrival of asylum seeker or refugees both in Europe and the UK. And I found this out because when they spoke about possible solution, resettlement is not seen as a solution complementary to the British financial contribution in particular in the MENA region, but is something as an opposite. So the government will say, we are already giving them the money, why we should take the refugee? And when they created this resettlement program, they were quite uncoordinated program and very bureaucratic. And they always, most of the time, they shift the responsibility for the operationalization of the program or to local authority or international organization. With regards to the motivational framing, so the motivation behind why people should join the community sponsorship, why we should have a community sponsorship, I didn't find any reason that the government was saying to people to join, but actually the motivation was coming from the bottom. So was people of the civil society organization, individual that put pressure of on the government to act, and also they show dissatisfaction of the government action, so they put pressure to create this community sponsorship. And I want to link also to the work that David was mentioned before. Even in the UK at the beginning was a no, the government didn't want to have a community sponsorship, but then after they launched the scheme, they using the scheme to promote the UK as a very welcoming country. So every time during the parliamentary debate, a issue came up regarding refugee and asylum seeker, community sponsorship was used as a good example of how welcoming the UK is. And so all this framing that I used in the debate for community sponsorship, basically the result is that community sponsorship is used more as a tool for migrant management rather than a tool as an international protection. I think it's almost the end of my time. It's like 5 minutes, but I will share my article in the chat if you are interested. You can have read that, and if you have any question, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriella. I've shared the paper in the chat actually.
Oh, that's perfect.
Really,
Thank
yeah,
you.
it's an amazing paper. Thank you so much. So we'll move on to Noran Ali. And Noran is a humanitarian corridor consultant at UNICEF Egypt, with over 6 years of experience working with refugees, victims of trafficking, and vulnerable migrants within Egypt. Noran has a master's degree in political sciences and has worked both in local NGOs as well as a number of different UN agencies. Currently, she's a humanitarian consultant for the education sector within UNICEF Egypt. And previously, she was awarded the Thomas A. Levy Prize from the University of New Brunswick for her paper on women and abortion in Canada. She's recently worked in Oman and Jordan during the Voices Against Violence Global Initiative, where she was invited to attend a panel on how to tackle gender-based violence in the region. And Noran, I'm really sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Names aren't my strong point, so feel free to correct me. But please, let's hear your presentation.
Sure. No, thank you for the introduction. And you're pronouncing my name correctly. Don't worry. It's pronounced differently by different nationalities, so it's okay. I'm used to it. Well, hi everyone. My name, Noran Ali. Today my research is it's tackling sponsorship from a different perspective. So I'm currently based in Egypt, and just to give you a brief about Egypt, Egypt is a transiting, receiving, and sending country, but it has restrictions on refugee status within its borders. So on personal status, labor, education. Among others. And of course, this creates an issue for refugees since we're a receiving country, right? So we have, the government says we have around 6 million refugees and migrants. Officially, UNHCR is the responsible entity in registering asylum seekers and refugees. And its status, its records are completely different from what's originally stated by the government, which this creates, of course, a problem of, okay, so how do we constitute who's vulnerable, who's a refugee, who's an asylum seeker? So normally we go with the UNHCR data, and we try to collaborate with the state on the actual figures or the areas where refugees are constituted. Another thing you might find interesting in Egypt, we don't have a camp for refugees. They're integrated into 6 geographic areas, which are very known across Egypt, where you know that they are residing and integrated with the host community. So, okay, so how does this relate to my research? So I shifted or twisted the question. So normally when you're talking about sponsorship, the main question that always comes up, and I noticed it in several research, is when sponsorship comes to an end, so what happens? So I tackle it from, okay, so now in transiting countries, what do refugees do when they're unable to resettle, when the global statistics for resettlement is only 1%, and voluntary repatriation is not an option? So integration is the only durable solution that comes into place, right? And since it's not officially an option in Egypt. So what do refugees do, or who are the actors who help in assisting these refugees? Okay, so I divided them into 3 categories or 3 groups, which are the host community, the refugee community, and then comes the UN agencies or local agencies or organizations working with refugees and with the government in order to provide the assistance to these vulnerable asylum seekers and refugees. In the host community, you would find different groups in providing, for example, support, either financial or in providing employment, or even sometimes in creating refugee community schools for dropout children. You'd have the refugee community, they're working in not only one element or one component, but you'll find them like having psychosocial support, education support, awareness raising among both the refugee community itself and among the host community. They're working in community mobilization, even in protection, as in particular for unaccompanied and separated children. They would actually take in and they sponsor the children themselves without receiving any kind of support from any other agency. And then you would have the organizations that are working with refugees. And of course, the challenges we face in this structure is you're creating a parallel system to the state where some of the services are available, and by law refugees are entitled to receive it on equal footing as host community citizens, but still because of the lack of awareness or the lack of state responsibility on refugees, they're unable to access these services. So they create what we call the parallel system. And then you have the organizations like UN agencies and other organizations who want to support, but are stuck with the lack of funding because you're creating a double system. And they're again bounded by their own, of course, mandates, and they're limited in a certain aspect. And so what we have been doing recently in the country, and that's where I'm trying to focus on, like what are the alternative solutions then to this sponsorship, is how do we create a humanitarian development nexus between the agencies or the actors who are in the field supporting the refugees and the communities that are already established, and how we can legalize them or let the state recognize their efforts and just have a legal status for them. Okay, so of course, most of the community initiatives or community sponsorships are not under a legal umbrella. So they're just operating and the government knows about them, but it's not supported by any kind. It's just self-funded, and as a result, they're unsustainable. And how can we pressure or shift the mindset of the state in order to, while they're developing, like because we're a country under development now, how can we include the humanitarian component, that how to benefit from the refugees that we have in-house, in terms of employment, instead of creating underground employment, how the state itself can benefit if these are legalized employability, education, instead of having refugee community schools, it will be more sustainable to integrate them into the country's educational system, and so on and so forth. So that's where the alternatives of sponsorship for me and how I'm doing this research. And I think I'm over my time, so I'll leave it for questions. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Noran. Yeah, I think this research sounds so interesting, because often when you're researching community sponsorship, well, you do only think about that 1% and you remain really focused on that. And actually the much, much larger number are those refugees who remain in those transit countries. So yeah, really, really fascinating. And last but definitely not least, we have Samaya Tekil. And Samaya, again, even though you've told me how to pronounce your name, I'm sorry, I probably pronounced it wrong. But she is a sociology PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Born and raised in Toronto, she had the privilege of engaging with newcomers from around the world through her personal and her professional experiences. And her doctoral research examines the relationship between mobility and global inequality. And in particular, she's looking at Canada's management of refugee migration. So if you'd like to take us away.
Thank you, Tash, for that really great introduction. So it's actually Samia, but I get everything, so that's okay. It's been great to hear so many really amazing presentations, and in many ways, what I'm going to be talking a bit about today is quite different, but I do see overlapping threads through the presentations. And like as Tash was saying, my doctoral work actually looks at, I'm doing kind of a comparative analysis between the asylum determination system in Canada and the private sponsorship of refugee program in Canada, and looking more broadly at Canada's management of both of those programs. And so the findings that I'll be talking about today was one thread. I conducted interviews and different content analysis of government publications and also organizations that are doing a lot of this work on the ground here in Canada. And a really strong thread I'll be talking about today that came out from like preliminary analysis that I'm doing for that work is something that I don't think I anticipated to find. But I think given kind of the attention in scholarly debate and in government debate as well across many countries that are now implementing private sponsorship programs, I think is really interesting. And that is monitoring. And when I say monitoring, it's kind of in Canada with the expansion of the private sponsorship of refugee programs over the last 5 years. And I would really say with the introduction of Operation Syria in 2016, when the program really expanded, the government introduced monitoring. And what that looked like was essentially government agencies kind of checking up on sponsors and resettled refugees to ensure that their sponsors were keeping up with their obligations as sponsors to newcomers, with ramifications in the cases where it wasn't happening. And that, because nothing like that ever existed prior to that, it was met with a lot of criticism, a lot of backlash from the wider sponsorship community in Canada. And that has kind of raised a lot of questions and continues today to be kind of a real point of contention between government actors and sponsors on the ground. You can imagine a lot of sponsors were kind of, and I think this also goes to with the backdrop of naming a key feature of sponsorship in Canada, for example. What I mean of naming is sponsors in Canada largely for the private kind of, for where sponsors are able to name a refugee overseas and invite, essentially sponsor and take care of all of the responsibilities that there are to, or their obligations towards that newcomer. So there is there's an existing link prior to newcomer, like refugees arriving and settling in Canada. That has really made up the bulk or the majority of sponsorships that are happening in Canada. There's a lot of scholarly kind of work that covers the percentage or kind of guesstimates as to how much that portion is made up of, whether they be family like linked sponsorships, just any kind of like pre-existing relationship, whether it be friends, neighbors, or whatever. There's some existing relationship between that. And while there's a lot of work that highlights kind of the benefit of this aspect that has remained integral to sponsorship in Canada, for example, groups are able to influence policy. For example, there is room for diversity by allowing private citizens to select individuals. There's work that suggests that perhaps the adaptation process for people who have prior links to Canada before arriving, there is some benefit to that. I think what I think remains to be explored, and what my doctoral work doesn't necessarily focus on directly, but what it has kind of led me to think, and I think it's important given the context that as sponsorship programs continue to flourish around the world, the aspect of monitoring or quality assurance, while it is kind of an important aspect, and there's a lot of legitimacy as to why governments would need to do this, the way that it's done in the context of family-linked sponsorships or any just linked sponsorships more broadly, because that can really include kind of the gamut, And as avenues to resettlement around the world kind of shrink, the private sponsorship of refugee program in Canada is really becoming an avenue through which reunification is happening, broadly speaking. So in that context, what does quality assurance look like? What does monitoring look like? And I think what has happened to date, there's been kind of a disconnect. So the way that the program, the sponsorship program in Canada currently operates, given that so many or such a high percentage of people arriving are linked and they don't necessarily follow kind of the way that I think the government intentioned or assumes that that sponsorship or resettlement will happen. A lot of times families or friends or extended, just people that have existing relationships, a lot of times you'll see they'll be opening up their doors, and that year of, because there's an obligation for sponsors to support newcomers for up to a year, a lot of times that year is happening within the homes of sponsors, and not necessarily in the way government sponsorship would happen, where like a housing would be set up very separate to the sponsors, and the lives are in more ways disconnected or not as intertwined, where there are previously existing kind of relationships. So I think there's so many questions I think that kind of maybe perhaps future research can address. What does monitoring, what does program assurance look like in the context of linked sponsorships, which is increasingly becoming more common? What does that mean for private public partnership for a program like the sponsorship program, which in many countries now is becoming really like a private public partnership? And are there alternatives? Are there alternatives to how monitoring or quality or program assurance can happen? Alternatives to what we kind of currently see happening? Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, and perhaps we can, if there's any questions, we can talk about that.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So that kind of concludes the presentations from our panel. I've got a few questions, but I mean, we're quite a small group, so if anybody particularly wanted to stick their hand up and ask a question by turning on their mic, I think that's possible. So if anybody wanted to do that, that's absolutely fine. I'll try and keep an eye out across the page. But I wonder if we could start with, Eliza asked well, it was a comment kind of question in the chat, but about this kind of distinction between public and private responsibility. And I wondered if it might be a good question to open with about, you know, like how do presenters or people that you've spoken to, like how do you view this placing of responsibility of refugee resettlement onto private actors? It would be quite difficult, I think, to talk about actors in this kind of context without referencing the really important role of civil society. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of open the conversation on this topic. I don't know if anybody particularly wants to go first. Yeah, I mean, Gabriella, are you happy to go first? I guess this, you know, this sort of touches on a few things that are discussed in your paper. So I don't know if you had a comment here.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more about the research that have been conducted in the UK, how sponsors see themselves, and also linking to the work of David, like a lot of people were religion people, so they see themselves as a sponsor, as they were an obligation to help others. So there was this humanitarian reason, but also more a reason for their religion, like so. There is always also thinking about a refugee helping other refugee. I don't really see them. They even don't consider themselves as volunteers. They see an obligation to do that, to helping those that they have been left behind. So. I mean, it's not something negative, and I mean, it's great that there is a humanitarian reason. I mean, it would be it would be crazy to not have it that, but at the same time, I think this shift the government responsibility. So community sponsorship is one of the instruments that can be used to help refugee and to resettle refugee. So it should not be the only solution, and the responsibility should not be placed only on a member of the civil society, even if they are willing to do that. Of course, is an additional tool. So as they get involved is something additional, and we should put pressure more on the government. And I think probably in the long term, as people get more involved in sponsorship, they neighbor, they network know about sponsorship and learn more about refugee situation, they will create more pressure on the government, so they will start to advocate it for the government to do more and put pressure on them. This is what I hope.
Yeah.
I can jump in a little bit. I think that's a fascinating question and debate, and I agree with everything that Gabriella just shared. And I think sort of the interviews that I had kind of reflect that many of the religious actors who came up with this idea of humanitarian corridors, I mean, like Gabriella said, are deeply motivated by their faith and a sort of relationship with other institutions, particularly governments, where they do agree that they should have responsibility, but it doesn't mean that should take the responsibility from faith actors. There's a sense in which, particularly in response to the tragic deaths in the Mediterranean, that there was this idea of like, what are we going to do as citizens, as people of faith? And so there is on one hand this motivation to assume responsibility. And I think what makes humanitarian corridors a particularly unique kind of legal admission policy is that they really minimally delegate to other institutions. They do partner where they sort of need to, but there is a sense in which they kind of want to create a parallel channel to some extent. Like, for example, the religious actors are the ones that go on the selection missions, using their deep networks with local faith communities in the context of Lebanon. And those very same people who do the selection and accompany through the whole process of applying and securing a humanitarian visa. They then also fly with them on planes. IOM is not involved. And then when it comes to the reception, again, they're kind of using that widespread hospitality model in Italy, where they're not going into the reception centers, state-run reception centers like by Cipriomi. They're staying with families and parishes and voluntary associations. So there is that, but at the same time, I think what's fascinating is that the religious actors will engage in both this form of cooperative and oppositional politics. So when it comes to wanting to do humanitarian corridors, they partnered because they needed to. But in other areas around asylum reception or regularization of migrants, these faith-based actors are also very ready to go to the streets and to make their opposition known. So they can play, they manage to play both roles. And at the same time, they were certainly aware of, not naive about the ways in which governments might sort of co-opt or frame these initiatives, kind of like what Gabriella was saying, like states will be very happy to promote what civil society actors are doing to kind of maybe cover these more restrictive policies that they're enacting. So they certainly weren't naive about that. And I think the religious actors went into the negotiation trying to make sure that they would not take the responsibility away from the state. That's why in the humanitarian corridors, a resistance point for them was to not back down from the principles of additionality and complementarity, because some of the initial response from the government says, oh, well, sure, you want to do these humanitarian corridors, why don't you just accept people that are selected by UNHCR? And they say, well, no, you as a state have a responsibility to do resettlement. And in fact, in Italy, at the exact same time as the humanitarian corridors were being negotiated, the resettlement program was also being sort of more established. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting debate, but it's one that I think the actors were aware of and try to thread this line of we have as responsibility, but at the same time, when it comes to areas where we think the state has responsibility, then we'll also hold them to account as well, which makes for an interesting dynamic relationship.
Noran, I think you had a comment too.
Yes, I was just it is this dilemma of whether you pressure the state to take the responsibility on the refugees that are on their ground, who they have made an international commitment on supporting them, versus what sometimes you find the community feels just obliged to do. In the context of Egypt, like I was saying, we already have the parallel systems, but again, in many aspects, they do put the pressure sometimes on the government on take responsibility. We are here. We need the support. We need, and that's why you find like even all the work that's divided when civil society is supporting the refugee communities and the host community on their support to refugees, is they focus on 3 elements of access to services, protection, and system strengthening. So what can we do to make the government realize, but at the same time use the voices of the refugees on ground in the context on advocating for themselves and for other nationality, different or diverse refugee nationalities, on the needs, on what do we need, we are here, what we can do. You need to focus more on including us in this, since you've agreed on accepting us, and especially now, or in the context, I'll come back to my own research and my own area, is it's just with Egypt now, with the limitation of illegal migration and cross-boarding to Europe. Now you'll find the people who are more stagnated in the country, and then so the government, yes, okay, so now you had a political stance on eliminating illegal migration, which is amazing, but now we're on your grounds. What are the alternatives you're going to provide us and support us with? So it's kind of when you have this alternative community sponsorship that's risen from the community itself, host community or refugee community, it's sometimes still like a political tool that you can use against the state to make them acknowledge their own or honor their own agreement to the international community when they accepted refugees in their land. So it kind of has both angles, and it is fascinating to see how it plays differently when you're talking about sponsorship programs.
Thanks, Noran. We've had a couple of questions about the monitoring process in Canada, so perhaps I can direct those to you, Samia. But we have a question from Nicolo, who's researched this humanitarian corridors model in Italy. And she'd like to ask you about the role of refugee opinions and the role of refugee views, what kind of role they can have in the monitoring process.
That's actually a really good question. And because so little research has been, I think perhaps none, if I can say, research has been done to actually document or systematically research kind of the monitoring program overall, I think you have to also remember that the monitoring, whenever the government decides or selects a case to actually follow up on, it's within the 1 year period of arrival. So within the sponsorship period, which is 12 months for the most part in Canada. There are several exceptions, but those are really few and far in between. So newcomers are still in their very vulnerable state. Many of them don't necessarily have their permanent residency documentation. They're new, still learning kind of the lay of the land. And any kind of communication from government that newcomers receive, you have to almost understand, or we can appreciate that it would be alarming. So whatever the state asks at that point, newcomers are more likely to just respond with whatever is necessary. I know that some have expressed, just anecdotally, a lot of newcomers have expressed that it is really uncomfortable many times, because if you can imagine, if the relationships or their sponsor is their older brother or sibling or extended family member, or just like a family friend, or someone that has essentially done so much to change a person's life by essentially allowing for the pathway for them to resettle in Canada. Providing any information to the government that may hinder or have some negative ramifications for that sponsor can be really difficult. So a lot of times the newcomer is kind of put in a very comfortable situation to offer information to the state on how well essentially their sponsor is doing. In terms of, I think you raise a good point though, to say that perhaps amplifying newcomer voice, the effects or impact of monitoring in the current way that it's done on newcomers.
Thanks. Do you have another question about monitoring, if you don't mind answering, about like what's the kind of focus of the Canadian government? Is it on this kind of financial, is it working out this financial commitment from the sponsors to the refugees they sponsor, or is it more about pre-settlement commitments like social support? And
so it really does cover all of it. There is something called like the settlement plan that sponsors at the time of application submission for the sponsorship family or individual. There are items that they agree to doing within that 1 year of settlement. It includes financial commitment. It includes a host of kind of different social supports that they agree to. So when the government monitors a case, it is those kind of items that they're checking up or following up to ensure that they have been met. And kind of to provide kind of the backdrop for the impetus or kind of rationale for why monitoring was introduced as being necessary, just for baseline kind of program quality assurance, but also when the expansion ships arriving in Canada, there were a lot of cases that were brought to the government's attention of sponsors or newcomers who were not being taken care of by their sponsors. And a lot of newcomers were falling through the cracks, provided the rationale and the backdrop for the introduction of the program.